I was 7 years old when I destroyed my family with 6 innocent words, and I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened. Every single one of us believes we would never betray the people we love, that our loyalty runs deeper than fear, deeper than confusion, deeper than the survival instinct itself. But what happens when you're just a child who doesn't even know what betrayal means? When the world around you speaks in whispers and coded phrases that you're too young to decode, when the adults in your life wear masks so convincing that you can't tell which face is real and which is performance meant to keep you all alive. It was 1953, and we lived in East Berlin in a cramped apartment that smelled like boiled cabbage and my mother's lavender soap, the kind of place where the walls were so thin you could hear the neighbors breathing, where everyone knew everyone else's business but pretended not to, where a knock on the door after dark could mean anything from a friendly visit to the end of everything you knew. And my parents taught me to be careful, always careful, to watch what I said and to whom I said it. But how do you teach a 7-year-old boy to understand that the friendly man who brings you chocolates might be the same man who will write down everything you say in a little black notebook that could seal your fate? I remember the day perfectly because it was my birthday, and my father had promised me something special even though we had almost nothing, even though the ration cards barely stretched to cover our basic needs. Even though my mother's hands were raw from the extra sewing work she took in just to earn a few more marks. And when he came home that evening with a small package wrapped in brown paper, I felt like the richest boy in the world. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that inside that package wasn't just a gift. It was evidence of everything my parents had been hiding, everything they had risked, everything they'd built in the shadows while I slept soundly in the next room believing that the world was simple and safe and that grown-ups always knew what they were doing. The gift was a book, a real Western book with glossy pages and colorful illustrations, the kind of thing that wasn't supposed to exist in our world, the kind of contraband that people whisper about but never touched. And my father's eyes were bright with something I now recognize as desperate hope when he handed it to me and said we had to keep it secret, that it was our special treasure, just for our family. But I was 7, and secrets felt like games, like the thrill of hiding under the bed, during hide and seek. Not like the iron chains they actually were, not like the nooses slowly tightening around all our necks. 3 days later, Herr Mueller came to visit. He was our neighbor from downstairs, a man with kind eyes and a soft voice who always asked about my schoolwork and sometimes brought me peppermints from his pocket, and I loved him the way children love any adult who pays them attention, who makes them feel seen and important. And we asked what I'd been reading lately, when he smiled that warm grandfatherly smile and ruffled my hair. I didn't see the trap. I didn't understand that his question wasn't casual conversation, but a carefully constructed snare. I just felt proud and excited to share my treasure. And so I told him about the book, about how my father had brought it home, about how he kept it hidden under the loose floorboard in my parents' bedroom, about how my mother had read it to me every night in whispers. And I watched his smile grow wider as I spoke, never noticing how his eyes had gone cold, never seeing how his hand moved subtly to the notepad in his jacket pocket. Can you imagine that moment, that precise instant when your innocence becomes a weapon turned against everything you love, when the words leaving your mouth are simultaneously the most honest thing you've ever said and the most devastating act of betrayal you'll ever commit? Except you don't know it yet, you're still just a happy child sharing a secret with a trusted friend, still believing that the world rewards honesty and punishes only those who deserve it, still living in that last precious moment before everything shatters. The Stasi came for them 4 days later, at 3 a.m. when the world was dark and silent, and I woke to the sound of boots on our stairs, heavy and rhythmic like a funeral march, and my mother's face appeared in my doorway, pale as death, and she pressed her finger to her lips in a gesture I'd seen 1,000 times, but never like this, never with such finality, such absolute terror barely controlled. And my father was already being dragged into the hallway, his hands behind his back. And I didn't understand. I kept asking what was happening. Why were these men in our home? What had my parents done wrong? And one of the officers, a young man who couldn't have been more than 20, looked at me with something that might have been pity and said, "Your parents are traitors to the Democratic Republic. Boy, enemies of the people." And the words meant nothing to me then. They were just sounds, just incomprehensible adult language. But I watched my mother's face crumble, watched my father's shoulders sag as if the weight of the world had finally crushed him. And in that moment, I still didn't connect my conversation with a Mueller to this nightmare unfolding in our tiny apartment. They let me say goodbye. I suppose even the Stasi had some procedures for the children of the condemned, and my mother held me so tight I couldn't breathe, and she whispered in my ear, "It's not your fault, Liebchen. Never think this is your fault. We love you. We will always love you." And those words haunt me still because she knew. She already knew what I had done even though no one had told me yet. She had pieced it together in whatever brief interrogation they'd already conducted, and instead of hating me, instead of pushing me away in her final moments of freedom, she used her last breath as my mother to try to absolve me of a guilt I didn't even know I should feel yet. And doesn't that destroy you? Doesn't that make you wonder what you would do if you were in her position? Whether you could find that kind of grace when facing execution, because your own child's innocent words had condemned you. I lived with my aunt after that, my father's sister, who looked at me like I was a ghost, who fed me and clothed me and never once spoke my parents' names. And it was 3 weeks before anyone told me the truth, before my uncle sat me down in their cold kitchen and explained that my parents had been executed, shot at dawn in the courtyard of Hohenschönhausen prison, and that it was my fault that I had told Herr Mueller about the book, that Herr Mueller was Stasi, an informant who had lived in our building specifically to watch families like ours, and that my words had been the evidence they needed to justify what they probably already decided to do. Now here's what I need you to understand, what I need you to stay with me to hear, because this isn't just a story about a child mistake or even about the cruelty of totalitarian regimes. It's about how innocence can be weaponized, how the systems we build to protect ourselves become the very mechanisms of our destruction, how guilt and responsibility become impossibly tangled when you're talking about a 7-year-old boy who loved his parents and trusted his neighbor and couldn't possibly have known that in the world of the Cold War, there was no such thing as an innocent conversation, no such thing as a simple truth, no such thing as childhood immunity from the grinding machinery of ideology and suspicion and state-sanctioned murder. So stay with me. Listen to what happened next, because the execution wasn't the end of this story. It was only the beginning of a life spent trying to answer one impossible question. When does a child become responsible for consequences he couldn't possibly have understood? And if the answer is never, then why does the guilt still feel like it's crushing my chest every single day 40 years later? The trial happened so fast it felt like falling. Like those dreams where you're tumbling through darkness and you keep reaching for something to grab onto, but there's nothing, just empty air and the certainty that the ground is rushing up to meet you. And I wasn't allowed in the courtroom at first because children weren't permitted to witness state proceedings against enemies of the people, but I begged, I screamed, I threw myself at my aunt's legs and pleaded until finally someone decided that maybe it would be good for me to see. Maybe it would teach me a lesson about the consequences of loose lips and careless words. Maybe my presence would serve as a reminder to my parents of exactly what their treason had cost. And so they let me sit in the back row of that cold stone room with its high ceilings and harsh fluorescent lights that made everyone look like corpses already. And I remember thinking how small my parents looked standing there in their prison clothes, how my father's shoulders were hunched in a way I'd never seen before, how my mother's hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together to keep them still. And the judge was a woman with steel gray hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of disgust, and she read the charges in a voice that was flat and mechanical, talking about conspiracy against the state, distribution of Western propaganda, corruption of socialist youth, espionage, sedition, and a dozen other words that meant nothing to my 7-year-old brain, except that my parents were in terrible trouble and somehow, in some way I still didn't fully understand, it was connected to me. They called witnesses, party officials, and neighbors who stood up one by one and testified about suspicious behavior, about how my parents kept strange hours, about visitors who came and went at odd times, about how my mother had once expressed doubts about the agricultural collectivization program, about how my father had been overheard making a joke about party leadership. And each testimony felt like another shovel of dirt being thrown onto a grave, and my parents just stood there, not defending themselves, barely responding when the judge asked them direct questions. And I didn't understand then that there was no point, that this wasn't really a trial in any meaningful sense, but rather a theatrical performance with a predetermined ending, that the decision to execute them had probably been made the moment the Stasi knocked on our door, that everything happening in this courtroom was just the official paperwork, the rubber stamp on murder dressed up in legal language and revolutionary justice. Then they called Herr Mueller to the stand, and I felt my heart jump because surely he would help. Surely this kind man who had always been so nice to me would tell them this was all a mistake, that my parents were good people who loved their country and their son. But instead, he sat there in his neat gray suit and recounted our conversation with perfect clarity, describing how I had volunteered the information about the book, how I had told him where it was hidden, how I had mentioned that my parents read it every night. And as he spoke, I began to understand, slowly, horribly, the way you understand you're sick when the fever starts to climb, that I had done something terrible, that my words had somehow betrayed my parents. And I want to stand up to scream that I didn't mean it, that I didn't know that I was sorry, but my aunt's hand clamped down on my shoulder like a vice and held me in place. And when her Mueller stepped down from the witness stand, he walked right past me, and for just a second our eyes met, and I saw nothing there, no warmth, no regret, no acknowledgement that he had used a child's trust to destroy a family, just blank efficiency, just a man who had done his job and done it well. My father finally spoke when they gave him the chance to make a statement before sentencing, and his voice was hoarse, broken. But he looked directly at me across that courtroom, and he said, "My son is innocent. He understood nothing. He bears no responsibility for anything that has happened here. And I beg this court, I beg the state, to remember that children are the future of our nation, and that punishing a child for the sins of his parents is not justice, but cruelty." And the judge actually laughed, this short, bitter sound that echoed off the stone walls. And she said, "No one is punishing your child, Herr Hoffman. We are punishing you. And if your son suffers as a result, then perhaps that will teach him to be more careful about the company his parents keep." And I watched my father's face collapse at those words, watched him realize that even in this final moment he couldn't protect me, couldn't shield me from what was coming, couldn't do anything except stand there and wait for the sentence he knew was inevitable. When my mother was given her chance to speak, she didn't address the court at all. She just looked at me and started talking, telling me about how much she loved me, about how proud she was of the boy I was becoming, about how I should grow up to be kind and honest and brave. And the judge kept trying to interrupt her, kept banging her gavel and demanding that the prisoner address the charges. But my mother just kept talking, kept pouring out these words like she was trying to give me enough. Love to last a lifetime in the 60 seconds before they silenced her. And finally 2 guards stepped forward and physically turned her around, forced her to face the judge instead of me. But even then she kept talking, kept saying, "I love you, I love you, I love you," until her voice was just a whisper and then nothing at all. The sentencing took less than 5 minutes. Death by firing squad for both defendants, to be carried out within 72 hours as prescribed by law for crimes of this magnitude. No appeals, no clemency, no mercy. Just cold, efficient state murder dressed up in legal procedure. And I didn't understand what death meant. Not really. I knew it was bad. I knew it meant I wouldn't see them again. But I couldn't grasp the permanence of it, the absolute finality, the way it would hollow out my entire world and leave me stumbling through the wreckage trying to understand what had happened and why. And as they led my parents out courtroom, my mother turned one last time and mouthed something to me. And I think it was, "Forgive me." But it might have been, "I forgive you," or maybe "Forgive yourself." And I spent 40 years trying to read those lips, trying to understand what she meant, what she wanted me to carry forward, whether she was asking for absolution, or offering it, or commanding me to find it somewhere in the rubble of what used to be our family. They took me to see them one final time the night before the execution, in a gray room with a guard standing in the corner and a table between us that might as well have been an ocean. And we had 15 minutes, exactly 15 minutes measured by the clock on the wall, with this loud mechanical ticking that counted down our last moments together. And I tried to apologize. I kept saying I was sorry. I didn't know. I didn't mean to. Please forgive me. And my father reached across that table and grabbed my hands and said, "Listen to me. You did nothing wrong. You are a child. You told the truth to someone you trusted. That is what children are supposed to do. The only villains in this story are the men who build a system that turns innocence into a weapon and children into informants. Do you understand me? You did nothing wrong." But his words couldn't reach me, couldn't penetrate the wall of guilt that was already building itself brick by brick inside my chest, couldn't change the fact that I absolutely knew with a certainty that only children have, that if I had just kept quiet, if I had just remembered what my parents had taught me about being careful, if I had just been a better son, they would still be alive. My mother used her precious minutes differently. She told me stories, the same fairy tales she used to tell me at bedtime, about brave princes and clever peasants and magic that could transform the world. And at first I didn't understand why she was wasting our last moments together on children's stories, why she wasn't crying or raging or trying to explain things. But now I think I understand. Now I think she was trying to give me something pure to remember, something that wasn't tainted by courtrooms and executions and guilt, something that belonged to the time before, when I was just a little boy and she was just my mother and the world was full of possibility instead of horror. And maybe she was also trying to tell me something about how stories survive even when people don't, about how the things we tell each other and the love we wrap around those tellings can outlast prison walls and firing squads and the grinding machinery of totalitarian states. But I was 7 and I just wanted her to stop talking about magic and start explaining how we could fix this, how we could make it go back to the way it was before I opened my stupid mouth and destroyed everything. The 15 minutes ended with a bell, loud and final, and the guard stepped forward and said time was up, and my father stood and straightened his shoulders and tried to look brave, tried to give me an image of strength to carry forward. But I could see him shaking, could see the tears he was fighting to hold back, could see the absolute terror underneath his massive courage, and my mother didn't even try to hide it. She just sobbed and reached for me, and the guard had to pull her away, had to, physically drag her toward the door while she screamed my name. And the last thing I heard her say was, "Be good, be so good, be better than all of this." And then she was gone. They were both gone, and I was standing in that empty gray room with my aunt, hand on my shoulder, and the clock still ticking on the wall. And I remember thinking very clearly, with the kind of crystalline certainty that cuts through everything else, that I would never forgive myself, never forgive her Mueller, never forgive the system that had turned my love for my parents into the instrument of their murder, and that somehow, someday, I would find a way to make someone pay for what had been taken from me. They shot them at dawn the next morning in the prison courtyard while I sat in my aunt's kitchen drinking weak tea and not knowing yet that it was happening, not knowing that at the exact moment I was pushing soggy bread around my plate. My parents were standing against a wall with their hands tied and their eyes covered, not knowing that my father's last words were my name, that my mother's last thought was about whether I would remember her face, not knowing that in a few hours' estate, official would knock on my aunt's door and hand her 2 death certificates and a bill for the bullets that had been used, because in East Germany even execution had to be paid for. Even murder came with administrative fees and bureaucratic procedures. And doesn't that tell you everything you need to know about the regime that raised me, that shaped me, that turned a 7-year-old boy into an orphan, and then had the audacity to charge his relatives for the privilege? They told me about the execution 3 hours after it happened, and I think they waited deliberately, wanted to make sure it was completely finished and irreversible before they let me know, wanted to eliminate any possibility that I might try to stop it, or that some last-minute miracle might intervene. And my aunt sat me down in the same kitchen where I'd eaten breakfast that morning not knowing my parents were already dead. And she said, "It's done. They're gone. You need to be strong now." And those words meant nothing to me. They were just sounds without meaning. Because how do you tell a 7-year-old that his parents have been murdered by the state? How do you explain that the people who tucked him into bed and sang him lullabies and promised to always protect him are now just bodies in a mass grave somewhere? How do you make a child understand permanence when his entire conception of the world is built on the assumption that parents are forever, that love is protection, that tomorrow will always come with another chance to make things right? I didn't cry at first. I just sat there feeling nothing, feeling like I've been hollowed out and filled with concrete, heavy and cold and unable to move, and my aunt kept talking, kept saying things about how they had died quickly, how they hadn't suffered much, how they had been brave at the end. And I wanted to scream at her that I didn't care how they died, that the manner of their death was irrelevant compared to the fact of it, that knowing they were brave didn't bring them back or undo what I had done. But I couldn't speak, couldn't make any words come out, could only sit there and stare at the pattern on the tablecloth and try to understand how the world could still exist when everything that mattered had just been erased from it. The guilt hit me like a physical thing, like someone had reached into my chest and grabbed my heart and squeezed until I couldn't breathe. And suddenly I was gasping, choking on air that felt too thick to swallow. And my aunt was shaking me, asking what was wrong. And I managed to say I killed them. I told her Mueller about the book, I Killed My Parents. And she slapped me hard across the face and said, "Don't ever say that again. Don't ever let anyone hear you say that. You did nothing. Wrong. The state killed them. The system killed them. Do you understand me? If you go around claiming responsibility, you'll end up just like them. And I realized in that moment that even my aunt was afraid, that even in her own kitchen, she was worried about who might be listening, about what consequences might fall on us if I spoke too honestly about what had happened. And that realization was somehow worse than everything else, worse than the execution itself, because it meant we couldn't even grieve properly, couldn't even acknowledge the truth of what had occurred without fear of joining my parents in their unmarked grave. I started having nightmares immediately, every single night, dreams where I was back in that courtroom. But this time I was the one on trial. This time the judge was asking me why I betrayed my parents, why I had traded their lives for Mueller's peppermints and kind words. And in the dreams, I tried to explain that I didn't know, that I was just a child, that I didn't understand, but the judge would just shake her head and say, "Ignorance is no excuse. Innocence is no defense." You spoke. The words and words have consequences. And then I would watch as they led my parents to the wall, and my father would turn and look at me with such disappointment, such profound sadness, and my mother would be crying and reaching for me, and I would try to run to them, but my legs wouldn't work, and then the shots would ring out, and I would wake up screaming, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets. And my aunt would come running and hold me until the shaking stopped, but she never asked what I'd dreamed about, never tried to comfort me with words, just held me in silence until I could breathe again. And in some ways, that silence was the worst part, the way we all conspired not to talk about what had happened, not to name the thing that was destroying me from the inside out. The funeral was private, just me and my aunt and uncle and 2 other relatives I barely knew. And there were no bodies because the state didn't return the bodies of executed criminals. They just disposed of them efficiently, probably in some mass grave or crematorium, probably without any marker or record of where they ended up. And so we stood in a cemetery looking at 2 empty holes in the ground while a priest said words about God's mercy and eternal rest. And I remember thinking how absurd it all was, how we were pretending to bury people who weren't there, how we were going through the motions of grief while the actual grief was so enormous and overwhelming that it couldn't be contained by ritual or ceremony or religious platitudes. And when the priest asked if I wanted to say anything, I just shook my head, because what was there to say? What words could possibly capture the enormity of what had been lost and what I had done, and how the world had revealed itself to be so much crueler and more complicated than any child should ever have to understand? School became impossible because the other children knew what had happened. Their parents had told them that my parents were traitors, enemies of the state, and that I was the son of criminals, and some of them treated me like I was contagious, like betrayal was a disease they might catch if they got too close, and others were actively cruel, calling me names, saying my parents had gotten what they deserved, saying I was lucky the state hadn't executed me too for being part of a traitor family. And I got into fights constantly, throwing punches at anyone who mentioned my parents, who said anything about what had happened. And the teachers would pull me off other students and send me to the principal's office, but they never really punished me, because I think they understood. I think even in that rigid system, some of them recognized that I was a child processing impossible trauma, and the only way I knew how, with fists and rage and a desperate need to make someone, anyone, hurt the way I was hurting. My aunt tried to help in her own awkward way. She bought me new clothes and made my favorite foods and took me to the park on weekends. But everything felt like ash in my mouth. Everything felt pointless and hollow, because my parents weren't there to see me in my new shirt. My mother wasn't there to smile when I ate the dumplings she used to make. My father wasn't there to push me on the swings. And I started to understand that grief isn't just sadness. It's the way everything in the world gets infected with absence. The way every single thing you do and see and experience gets filtered to the missing, through the constant awareness of who should be there and isn't, through the unbearable weight of all the moments they'll never witness, and all the conversations you'll never have, and all the love that has nowhere to go except inward, where it curdles into something toxic and self-destructive. I became obsessed with Mueller, with understanding why he had done it. What kind of person uses a child's trust as a tool for murder? And I would watch his apartment from the street, would see him coming and going with his shopping bags and his newspaper, living his normal life as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't destroyed an entire family. And I fantasized constantly about revenge, about all the things I would do to him when I was older and stronger, about how I would make him understand what he had taken from me. And those fantasies became the only thing that made me feel alive, the only thing that cut through the numbness and gave me any sense of purpose or direction. Because if I was going to live in this world without my parents, if I was going to carry this guilt and this grief through every remaining day of my life, Then at least I could dedicate myself to making sure that the people responsible paid some kind of price, even if that price could never be adequate, could never balance the scales or bring back what had been lost. 3 months after the execution, I tried to kill myself. I took all the pills I could find in my aunt's medicine cabinet and swallowed them in handfuls, thinking that maybe if I died, then the guilt would stop. Maybe if I joined my parents, then at least we'd be together again. Maybe death was the only escape from the endless loop of blame and grief and self-hatred that had taken over my brain. And I remember lying on the bathroom floor, feeling the pills start to work, feeling my body get heavy and slow, and thinking, finally it will stop hurting. But my aunt found me before I lost consciousness, found me and screamed for my uncle, and they got me to the hospital where they pumped my stomach and saved my life, even though I didn't want to be saved, even though I begged him to just let me go, to let me slip away into whatever darkness was waiting. And when I woke up in a hospital bed with tubes in my arms and my aunt crying beside me, my first thought wasn't relief or gratitude, but rage. Pure burning rage that I couldn't even die properly, that I couldn't even end my own suffer without someone interfering. And the doctors talk about depression and trauma and prescribe medications that made me feel like I was moving through fog. And my aunt watched me constantly after that, terrified I would try again, terrified she would fail in her duty to keep me alive, terrified that she would lose me the same way we'd lost my parents. The state assigned me a counselor, a thin woman with glasses who worked for social services, and whose job was to make sure I was being properly rehabilitated, properly educated in socialist values, properly integrated into society despite my parents' crimes. And she would ask me questions about how I felt and what I thought about the party, and whether I understood why my parents had been punished. And I learned very quickly to lie, to tell her exactly what she wanted to hear, to perform the role of the reformed child who had learned from his parents' mistakes, who understood that the state was just and necessary and good, who held no resentment or anger or desire for revenge. And she would nod and write things in her notebook and tell my aunt that I was making excellent progress. And the whole time I was thinking about a Mueller, about the judge with her steel gray hair, about the guard who had dragged my mother away while she screamed my name, cataloging them all in my mind, promising myself that someday, somehow, I would make them all understand what they had done, what they had taken, what they had created when they decided to weaponize a child's innocence and call it justice. The weight of what I carried became my identity. It became the lens through which I saw everything, the filter through which I processed every experience, every relationship, every moment of joy or sadness or fear. Because I wasn't just a boy anymore. I was the boy who killed his parents, the boy whose words had become bullets, the boy who would carry that knowledge every single day for the rest of his life. And I started to understand that this was my sentence, this was my execution, except mine would be slow, would last decades, would kill me piece by piece with every breath and every memory and every night when I closed my eyes and saw my mother reaching for me across that prison table. And I wondered if my parents had known, in those final moments before the bullets tore through them, that the real punishment wasn't their death, but my survival, that the cruelest thing the state could do wasn't to execute them, but to let me live with what I had done, to turn me into a walking monument to the price of carelessness, a cautionary tale that would haunt me far more effectively than any prison sentence or public humiliation ever could. And in that realization, I found something that wasn't quite peace, but was at least understanding, that I was already dead in every way that mattered, that the boy I had been died the same morning my parents did, and that whoever I became after this, whoever grew up in the shell of that dead child, would be someone fundamentally shaped by absence and guilt and the terrible knowledge that in this world, in this system, in this life, there is no such thing as innocence that cannot be corrupted, no such thing as love that cannot be turned into a weapon, no such thing as childhood that cannot be sacrificed on the altar of ideology and fear and the grinding machinery of a state that feeds on its own people and calls it progress. The years after their deaths were not a straight line but a spiral, circling down and then up and then down again, each loop bringing me back to the same central truth that I had killed my parents with 6 innocent words. And no matter how many times people told me I was just a child, no matter how many times therapists and counselors and well-meaning relatives tried to shift the blame onto the system, or Mueller, or the historical circumstances of Cold War paranoia, I could never quite believe them because I was the one who spoke. I was the one who trusted when I should have been suspicious. I was the one who failed to protect the people who had spent their entire lives trying to protect me. And that failure became the foundation of everything I built afterward, the crack in the concrete that would eventually bring down every structure I tried to erect on top of it. I grew older and the world changed around me. The wall fell in 1989, and suddenly East Germany ceased to exist. Suddenly the system that had murdered my parents was being dismantled piece by piece. Suddenly people were accessing Stasi files and discovering who had informed on whom. Suddenly the mechanisms of surveillance and betrayal were being exposed to sunlight. And I was 36 years old when I finally worked up the courage to request my parents' file, to see in writing exactly what had been done to them and why. And I remember sitting in that archive room with a manila folder in front of me, hundreds of pages documenting every aspect of my parents' lives, every conversation that had been monitored, every movement that had been tracked, every friend who had been questioned. And there was on page 47, the report from her Mueller dated 3 days before the arrest, describing in clinical detail his conversation with me, noting my age and demeanor, commenting that I had been remarkably forthcoming, and that the child appears to have no understanding of his parents' criminal activities. And I sat there reading those words over and over, this bureaucratic description of my betrayal. This evidence that even the man who had manipulated me recognized that I didn't know what I was doing, and somehow that made it worse. Somehow knowing that even her Mueller understood I was innocent made my guilt feel more permanent, more deserved, because if everyone could say I was just a child except me, then maybe the problem wasn't what I had done, but something fundamentally broken in my ability to forgive myself, some defect in my moral architecture that would never allow me to accept absolution no matter how clearly it was offered. I tried to find a Mueller after the wall fell, spent months tracking him down through old addresses and municipal records, and I finally located him in a nursing home in Leipzig, a shriveled old man in his 80s who barely remembered his own name, let alone the family he had destroyed 40 years earlier. And I sat across from him in the common room with its smell of disinfectant and old age, and I told him who I was, reminded him about the book and the conversation, and what had happened to my parents. And he just looked at me with watery, confused eyes and said, "I did my duty. I served the state. I have nothing to apologize for." And I realized that I had been waiting decades to confront this man, had built entire fantasies around making him understand and regret what he had done. And he didn't even have a capacity for remorse, didn't even possess enough self-awareness to recognize that using a child as an informant might have been morally questionable. And I left that nursing home feeling more hollow than when I arrived, because even revenge, even confrontation, even the satisfaction of making him acknowledge his crimes, all of it was impossible. All of it had been taken from me by time and dementia, and the way history moves on whether we're ready or not, grinding up perpetrators and victims alike into dust and memory and incomplete records and archive boxes. I got married when I was 28 to a woman named Karen who knew everything about my past and loved me anyway, who thought she could help me heal, who believed that love and patience and time would eventually soften the edges of my guilt. And we had 2 daughters, beautiful girls with their mother's eyes and my father's smile. And I tried so hard to be a good father, to give them the child that I had lost, to protect them from every possible harm. But I was suffocating them with my fear, watching them constantly, interrogating them about their friends and teachers, making them promise over and over that they would never talk to strangers, never trust too easily, never repeat family conversations outside our home. And Karen finally confronted me when our oldest was 7, the same age I had been when everything fell apart. And she said, "You're not protecting them. You're teaching them to be afraid. You're passing your trauma on to them like an inheritance. And I can't watch you do this anymore." And she was right. I could see in my daughters' faces the way they had started to move through the world with the same hypervigilance I carried, the way they had absorbed my fear without understanding its source. And I realized that the execution hadn't ended with my parents, that it was still happening, still radiating outward through time and relationships, still claiming victims decades after the bullets had been fired, and that if I didn't find some way to stop it, to break the cycle, I would destroy my daughters the same way I had destroyed my parents, not with betrayal, but with the weight of unbearable love turned toxic by trauma. Therapy helped. Eventually, after years of resistance and false starts and walking out of sessions when therapists got too close to the core of it, I found someone who understood that healing doesn't mean forgetting, doesn't mean absolving myself completely, doesn't mean pretending it didn't matter or that I bore no responsibility, but rather means learning to carry the weight differently, learning to distribute it across my entire life instead of letting it crush one central point, learning to tell the difference between the guilt that was mine to carry and the guilt that belonged to a system designed to create exactly this kind of damage. And slowly, painfully, over years of work, I began to understand that a 7-year-old child cannot be held to the same moral standard as an adult, that innocence exploited is not the same as malice intended, that I was as much a victim of the Stasi as my parents were, even though my victimization took a different form, even though I survived while they didn't, even though I have had to live with the consequences, while they were released from them by death. I started speaking publicly about my experience in the late 1990s, giving talks at schools and universities about the mechanics of totalitarianism, about how dictatorships survive by turning citizens into informants, by making everyone complicit in everyone else's surveillance, by weaponizing trust and intimacy and the bond between parents and children. And at first it was excruciating standing in front of strangers and telling them the worst thing I had ever done, admitting my role in my parents' deaths. But over time I started to notice something. People would come up to me afterward with tears in their eyes and tell me their own stories about the time they had informed on a colleague, about the friend they betrayed under pressure, about the family member they had reported for some minor infraction that had spiraled into catastrophic consequences. And I realized that I wasn't alone, that the system had created thousands of people like me, maybe tens of thousands, all of us carrying our own versions of this guilt, all of us trying to figure out how to live with what we had done or what had been done to us or the impossible tangle of the two. And somehow knowing that made it bearable, not easier exactly, but bearable, because shared suffering is still suffering, but it's also community. It's also recognition. It's also the knowledge that you're not uniquely monstrous, that you're just human, just fragile, just one more person trying to survive in a system designed to break precisely these kinds of bonds and call it security. My mother's last words to me, the ones I spent decades trying to decode, turn out to be, forgive yourself. I'm almost certain now, and I think she knew even then that the hardest part wouldn't be living without them, but living with what I believed I had done. And she was trying to give me permission to let go, to be a child who made a child's mistake instead of a murderer who deserves eternal punishment. But forgiveness is not a switch you flip. It's not a decision you make once and then. It's a practice, a daily choice to extend to yourself the same compassion you extend to any other 7-year-old in the same situation. To ask yourself honestly what you would say if your own daughter came to you with this story, whether you would condemn her or comfort her, whether you would tell her she was a killer or tell her she was a victim. And every time I imagine that scenario, every time I picture one of my girls sitting across from me with that look of devastation and guilt, I know exactly what I would say. I would hold her and tell her it wasn't her fault, that she was manipulated, that she couldn't have known, that I loved her and nothing could ever change that. And yet somehow I still struggle to say those same words to the child I was, to offer myself the same grace I would offer anyone else. And maybe that's the real punishment. Maybe that's the execution that never ends, the inability to forgive ourselves even when everyone else already has, even when the only person still holding us accountable is the voice in our own head. Herr Mueller died in 2003. I read about it in the newspaper, just a small obituary noting his service to the former German Democratic Republic and his surviving family. No mention of the lives he had destroyed, or the children he had manipulated, or the fact that he lived to be 87 while my parents didn't live to see 40. And I thought I would feel something when I read it, relief or satisfaction or closure. But I felt nothing, just the same emptiness I had been carrying for 50 years. Because his death didn't change anything, didn't bring my parents back, didn't erase what happened, didn't even provide the satisfaction of knowing he had suffered. And I realized that I had been waiting for external events to resolve my internal struggle, waiting for someone to punish the right people or acknowledge the right truths or say the right words that would finally make it okay. But that's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. Because the only person who can release me from this guilt is me. The only person who can decide when I've suffered enough is me. The only person who can choose to stop executing myself day after day after day is me. I'm 62 years old now. I've lived longer without my parents than I live with them. I've built a life that includes joy and love and purpose. I've raised daughters who are healthy and kind and not broken by my brokenness. I've done work that matters and helped people who are struggling with their own versions of what I went through. And yet still on certain days, especially in the early morning when the light is a particular shade of gray, I wake up and I'm 7 years old again. I'm sitting across from her Mueller with his kind smile and his peppermints, and I'm opening my mouth to tell him about the book, and I can see the moment stretching out before me. I can see the choice I'm about to make even though I didn't know it was a choice at the time, and I want to reach back through time and grab that little boy and shake him and tell him to shut up, to lie, to protect his parents the way they had always protected him. But I can't. None of us can change the past no matter how desperately we want to. We can only decide what it means. We can only choose how we carry it forward. We can only determine whether our mistakes define us completely or whether they're just one part of a larger story that includes growth and change and the possibility of redemption. Not redemption in the sense of earning forgiveness or balancing some cosmic ledger, but redemption in the sense of using our suffering to prevent others from suffering the same way, of transforming our worst moment into wisdom that might help someone else survive their own worst moments, of refusing to let the cruelty we experience turn us cruel, of insisting that even in a world that treats innocence as a weapon and childhood as expendable, we can still choose to protect the innocent, to defend the vulnerable, to build systems that don't require children to become informants or parents to die for the crime of owning a book. The truth I've finally come to accept, the truth that took me 55 years to fully understand, is that I will carry this guilt until I die. It will never completely leave me. It will never be fully resolved. There will never be a moment when I can honestly say I'm at peace with what happened. But that doesn't mean I have to let it destroy me. That doesn't mean I have to pass it on to my children. That doesn't mean I have to spend every remaining day executing myself for a crime I committed when I was too young to know what crime meant. Because the real dishonor to my parents' memory isn't that I made a mistake, isn't that I was used by the system they were fighting against, but would be if I let that mistake consume me so completely that I never became the person they hoped I would be, never lived the life they died trying to give me, never found a way to take the broken pieces of what happened and forge them into something that might help others avoid the same fate. And so I keep going. I keep telling the story. I keep working to make sure people understand how totalitarianism functions, how it infiltrates the most intimate spaces, how it turns love into liability and family into danger, how it creates situations where children destroy parents and everyone involved is both victim and perpetrator. And if my story can help even one person recognize these dynamics, can help one family protect themselves, can help one child avoid being used the way I was used, then maybe, just maybe, my parents' deaths weren't completely meaningless. Maybe there's some tiny scrap of purpose that can be salvaged from the wreckage. Maybe the execution that started in 1953 can finally end not with my death, but with my choice to stop punishing myself, to stop being both prisoner and executioner, to accept that I was just a boy, just a child who trusted when he shouldn't have, who spoke when he should have, stayed silent, who made an innocent mistake in a world that had no room for innocence, and that while I cannot change what happened, cannot bring my parents back, cannot undo the consequences of those 6 words I spoke to Mueller over chocolate and kind smiles, I can choose how the story continues from here. I can choose whether their legacy is just another casualty of the Cold War, or whether it's a lesson that helps prevent future casualties. I can choose whether I remain forever frozen, at age 7 in that moment of betrayal, or whether I allow myself to grow beyond it, to become someone who understands both the fragility of innocence and the importance of protecting it. Someone who knows intimately the price of careless words in a world built on surveillance and suspicion. Someone who can look at children and see not potential informants, but human beings who deserve to be shielded from the kind of impossible choices that no child should ever have to make. And in that choice, in that daily decision to transform guilt into purpose and trauma into wisdom, I find not forgiveness exactly, not peace, not resolution, but something close to acceptance. Something that allows me to wake up each morning and face another day, another opportunity to honor my parents not by destroying myself in penance, but by living fully, by loving fiercely, by fighting to create a world where what happened to us can never happen again, where children can be children, where innocence is protected rather than exploited, where the weight of history doesn't crush each new generation, but instead teaches them to build something better, something that doesn't require sacrifice of the young and vulnerable, something that recognizes that the true measure of any society is not its ideology or its economic system or its military might, but simply this: how it treats its children, whether it protects them or uses them, whether it allows them to be innocent or forces them to become complicit, whether it builds a future where they can grow up without carrying the weight of adult sins. And by that measure, the system that killed my parents was an absolute failure, a moral catastrophe, a machine that ground up families and called it progress. And the only way to defeat it, even now decades after it collapsed, is to refuse to let it have the final word, to refuse to let it define me completely, to insist that I am more than the worst thing that ever happened to me, more than the worst thing I ever accidentally caused, more than the guilt and the grief and the endless loop of what-ifs and if-onlys. I am also my father's son and my mother's boy. I am also a husband, a father, and a teacher. I am also someone who survived and who helps others survive. I am also living proof that even the most catastrophic trauma doesn't have to be the end of the story, that we can carry unbearable weight and still keep walking, that we can make terrible mistakes and still deserve to. Live, that we can be complicit in systems we didn't create and still fight to dismantle them, that we can be both guilty and innocent, both perpetrator and victim, both destroyed and somehow, impossibly, still here, still breathing, still trying, still hoping that maybe today will be the day when the weight gets just a little bit lighter, when the guilt becomes just a little more bearable, when the memory of my mother reaching for me across that prison table becomes less about what I took from her and more about what she tried to give me. Permission to survive, permission to grow, permission to become someone who takes the lessons learned in blood and tears and uses them to protect others from the same fate. And isn't that what any parent wants? Isn't that the final gift they try to give their children even in the worst circumstances? The hope that somehow, despite everything, despite the cruelty and injustice and the systems designed to break us all, we might still find a way to live lives that matter, lives that mean something, lives that transform suffering into purpose and guilt into determination, and loss into a fierce commitment to never let it happen again.